Do we really need DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency? Let's talk about that. Hi, folks. Tony DeWitt again with another video on the law. Remember, I don't dispense legal advice here, and this is what we're talking about today. Anyone who tells you that the government is not inefficient should probably be institutionalized, or either that or they have never dealt with either the VA or the TSA. A case in point. Several years ago, I went to go see a politician give a speech, and this person had Secret Service protection. So we had to go through the metal detectors and everything like that. And I had my car keys with me, my car keys with me. And on the car key, I had what we in the military would call a P38. It's a little can opener that you can pop out the blade. It's about that long, and you can use it to open up a can. We used to use it to open up C ration cans or K ration cans when we were in the Army. And so I found it to be a very useful tool. You can use it as a screwdriver, lots of things you can do with it, and it does open cans quite nicely. So, for example, when we have a power outage around here, which happens a lot in the spring because of lightning and high winds, the nice thing about having it is that you have something you can open cans with when there's no electricity. When I got to the point where they looked at my car keys, the guy said, "What's this?" And I explained it. He said, "It has to come off your key ring." I said, "What?" "It's got a sharp blade on it." Like, well, yeah, it's designed to be a can opener. You can't bring a can opener in here. So I took off my key ring, the P38. He seized it. I never got it back. I mean, the thing cost 15 cents, I think, at the time. So it wasn't like I had a big loss, but like you really expect that I'm going to be sitting in a seat inside this auditorium. I'm going to step past 4 or 5 people, get into the hallway, run down the aisle, jump up on the stage, flip open my little tiny can opener, and try and hurt this person with a can opener? I mean, do you hear what you're saying? I could have done that. I could have said that to the guy who happened to be a TSA agent, but I didn't. And of course, the reason I didn't is because he's a robot. He doesn't have it exceeded his programming. "Ooh, can't have it." There was nothing more he could add, and there's no way to reason with somebody like that. And if you try to reason with somebody like that, you're liable to wind up on a no-fly list. So I just handed it to him and let it go at that. But honest to goodness, you would think that the government could employ people who understand that a tiny can opener is not a deadly weapon. Who knew? Anyway, as somebody who battled fraud against the government for 30 years, I can attest that the government has been the target of thousands of schemes to soak it for fraudulent and wasteful enterprises. In every case that I was involved in, it was a corporation that was trying to do this to the government. In fact, it's pretty amazing not that the government sues and recovers damages against people who commit fraud against it, but rather how many of them are never pursued in spite of specific information showing the fraud. In my career, only about 25% of the False Claims Act cases I brought to the DOJ were ever settled by the government. And many of them only settled because we either had a great state attorney general lawyer on there or because the private lawyers did the majority of the legwork. DOGE, however, has not been directing its efforts at corporate actors stealing from the government, but rather at the bloated and inefficient operation of the government as a whole, meaning they think there's too many people doing things that fewer people could do, and the processes through which they are performing these acts are also tremendously inefficient. One of the things that people who program computers understand is that spaghetti code is not a good idea, meaning that you don't fix things by adding patches that send the computer on these long routes around a particular problem. Rather, you deal with things in the original program, you anticipate, and you make it efficient that way. There's a big difference between the amount of code that somebody who writes good programming writes in a very tight operation as opposed to somebody who simply just wants to get to a result and doesn't care what the code looks like. Again, the whole idea of DOGE trying to make the government more efficient is a good idea. You know, a lot of people live off Social Security. That operation is generally pretty good about fixing problems and it's responsive. It may have more people than it needs, but at least in my interactions with it, it is reasonably efficient. And again, I think that's a good thing. But that's not all government agencies. Not all government agencies are quite as efficient. Take, for example, CMS. Now, CMS is the Center for Medicare Medicaid Services at the Health and Human Services Division. These people operate a massive bureaucracy, and it frequently moves at the speed of glacial ice. Several years ago, a courageous whistleblower came to me with a claim that the radiology group she worked for was turning in false claims to the government for MRI exams that were incomplete. Now, I'm sure there's probably an MRI scientist out there who's going to listen to this explanation and say I've got it all wrong. And if he does, I will happily make any corrections to this video that I need to make. So I'm not sure if you know how an MRI works, but essentially the giant 3 or 4 Tesla magnet inside this thing, it lines up all of the hydrogen ions in your body along with the magnet, and then it uses an FM radio wave to knock them out of alignment. And then it listens for those to come back into alignment. Using this process, it can detect changes in tissue, differences in tissue like tumors, injuries, swelling. In fact, one of the things that people knew quite a lot about in terms of just knowing that it had to exist was uh, bone swelling. They knew that bones, when they were injured, tended to swell, but there was never any radiographic proof of it. But MRI, that can deliver that kind of proof. It can show when a bone has edema and then swelling. One of the things that's important when you do MRIs is that you use a protocol that produces good images. So the amount of time that the magnet's on, the amount of the time that is listening, and of course the way the computer processes all of the signals that it gets. But there's also a way that if you think the protocol that you have is too slow, meaning that it takes 30 minutes to do an MRI as opposed to the 20 that you'd like to see, you can change some of those things with the understanding that changing some of those things may alter the quality of the images. Now, good technical operators adapt their equipment to different body sizes and shapes and usually get pretty good pictures. However, some operations simply don't have the time or have too much business to allow them to spend the appropriate amount of time doing the kinds of MRIs that give you excellent pictures. At the time, CMS had a code for billing MRIs that included a code for an incomplete study, meaning that for whatever reason, if somebody, for example, couldn't tolerate the MRI machine, because it can be kind of claustrophobic, the clinician could still bill for the study. They would just bill at this incomplete procedure code. Well, the whistleblower raised the issue that the operation of the radiology group was not billing these incomplete studies that she was seeing as incomplete studies. They were billing them as full studies. And her initial reaction to that was, that's got to be fraud. So she was concerned about the way the images looked and the fact that they were nearly uninterpretable. So we brought this to the Department of Justice. We filed the case with the government, and the DOJ initially gets 60 days to investigate. Because it's HHS, the government automatically asked for a 6-month extension. It was granted. And then the government asked for an additional 6 months extension, and it was granted. We've now been in this case for a year. And then they got a third extension, and about a week and a half before that extension was to expire, they said, hey, come on down to the office, bring your relator, bring the whistleblower, and let's see what we can tell you about this case. Well, when we got in there, they said, sorry, your claim's invalid. What? I couldn't figure out how in the world our claim could be invalid if they were indeed providing images that were not meeting medical standards and they were not billing for these incomplete studies. So it wasn't even debatable. But the problem wasn't with the MRI group or even with the shoddy images. The problem was with CMS itself. It had taken 18 months for someone to sit down, evaluate the claim, look at the structures and the processes that are used to process the claim, and explain to the DOJ that while there was a separate code to bill for an incomplete procedure, that an incomplete procedure was billed at exactly the same rate as a complete procedure, going into question why in the world you would ever need two codes in the first place. As a result, we had to dismiss the claim because the government had not been damaged in the way that we thought it had. Seriously, it takes this particular entity 18 months to look at something that a clerk could have given them an answer to in 10 minutes? I don't think I was ever more disappointed in our federal government than in that case. Generally speaking, I like the idea of DOGE. I like the idea of trying to make the government more efficient. I'm not sure the best way to accomplish that is by firing 50% of the staff doing the work. Maybe we could get by with just a few less people being fired, but I'm hopeful that someone will actually take a look at the processes and figure out why the government becomes so inefficient in the way it does things. I can only imagine the meeting where the MRI rates were set. Hey, Maury, I think we need to have a code for these incomplete MRI studies. Hey, Sid, I think that's a great idea. Why don't you get into that? So they set up this code for an incomplete study and they send it up the line to their boss. The boss says, yeah, good idea. Let's send this over to the people who set the rates. So they send it over to the rate setting people, and the rate setting people look at it and they say, seems kind of unfair to pay less for what they bill on an incomplete study. I mean, they spent the same amount of time as they would for a complete study. I mean, that's just not fair to bill a different amount. So, we'll just pay them the same amount for an incomplete study as a complete study. And nobody thought to ask, well, then why do we need a code for incomplete studies? This is your government at work. The idea that the government is inefficient because there's fraud is less at issue than it is that they're just people who are not good at their jobs. It really isn't that the government's engaging in fraud against the taxpayer. It's that many of the people hired into these government positions have the IQ of an eggplant. They don't think things through, and sometimes policy is set at the lowest level possible. You have someone who's been working for the government for 2 or 3 years. Somebody who's above them leads or gets promoted, and they get promoted into a position that they're clearly not qualified for, but they meet other requirements for whatever reason. They have the right degree, for example, even though they've never done this kind of work, but they hang on to that position like a person hanging on to a ledge in Yosemite. As the result, they get to make policy and they're completely unable to formulate that policy effectively or to understand how their policy is going to affect people who are doing these jobs. To me, the problem with DOGE is that they're using a broad axe instead of a scalpel to make the government more efficient. Now, certainly, there are a lot of people in the government who probably should be let go. Now, there's a story, I'll tie this in, trust me. There's a story told to me by a former Green Beret that during an operation in the jungles of Vietnam, there was a special forces warrior who was bitten on the left hand by a bamboo viper. Now, bamboo vipers are deadly snakes. They're neurotoxic. And in fact, somebody had once called them the Our Father snake because that's about all the time you have left, the time necessary to say the Lord's Prayer. At any rate, the person who was behind him had a machete. He saw him get bit on the hand, and he took the machete and chopped off the guy's hand at the wrist, thereby saving his life. And I guess at some point he also chopped off the head of the snake, sort of to balance the scales of justice. But the point is, sometimes large parts of the body need to go away. That happens. It's not pleasant, it's certainly painful, but again, if the body continues to operate, that's a good thing. DOGE is making some painful cuts. and they may wind up having to rehire some of these people. But I don't necessarily fault them for the approach they've taken, other than just it seems to be way too much, way too soon. What we have is Doge firing people that they doesn't appear to be doing it on merit or experience or longevity within the organization. It doesn't appear that anybody is looking at the levels of expertise of the individuals being let go, and that could certainly cause some problems in the future. While I generally celebrate the idea of making government more efficient, and I certainly celebrate the idea of reducing the tax burden on the American taxpayer, because I am one, I think it needs to be done surgically as opposed to having mass firings, but that's just my opinion. And listen, I'm nowhere near as smart as Elon Musk. Elon's a brilliant guy and he knows a lot of things. Anybody who can shoot a rocket into space and then recover the booster on the same gantry that we used to shoot it out there, that's a guy that's a lot smarter. That's a lot smarter than the average bear. And that's not me. I'm not smarter than the average bear. And while I have some compassion for many of the government workers losing their jobs, it's not like there are no jobs out there in the private sector that pay a lot better than many of those government jobs. And in addition to that, many of them have better benefits, but certainly not all of them. It's very disconcerting to lose your job. Hey, I know, I just had that happen to me in July. But any opportunity to really discover yourself, to reinvent yourself, to rediscover yourself, that's an opportunity that should be seized and not whined about. These people will go on to do great things, likely in the private sector, or maybe they'll start their own business based on their knowledge and expertise in how the government operates. Whatever happens, I wish them luck, and I also wish luck to the people at DOGE. Making the government more efficient is a great thing. But unfortunately, I've seen this opera before. I recognize the music, and it's liable to turn out the same way, and no, the hero isn't going to get the girl. But just because it's liable to turn out that way doesn't mean that it shouldn't be tried. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. Come on back, catch me down here at the beach tomorrow. Thanks for watching my video. If you have a request for me to cover a topic, please send me an email to the address above, and in the subject line put video request. If you have comments, drop them in the comments down below. If you found the content worthy, please consider subscribing. Since I started doing this work, I have always asked listeners to consider doing just one kind thing every day to make somebody else smile or make their life better in some way. Please consider doing that. It makes the world a better place. Now, YouTube has some suggestions for other videos of mine you may find interesting.